It was one of those nights where I just couldn't shake off the eerie feeling, the kind of darkness that suffocates you, and the only lights are from the streetlights flickering in the distance. It was the dead of night, and I was driving alone on a deserted highway, the only source of light being my headlights illuminating the way. I had just left a friend's party and was on my way home, but my heart was racing with the knowledge that anything could happen on a night drive like this. As soon as I had driven a few miles alone, I saw a strange hitchhiker standing there on the side of the road, seemingly hugging themselves in the cold. I could see that she was wearing a heavy coat that looked like it was too big for her and had a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She looked like she was in trouble, and I pulled over to offer her a ride. "Thanks," she said in a shaky voice, warily getting into the car. She didn't seem comfortable being in the car with me either, but I started driving anyway and back on my way. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Anywhere's good, just away from here," she replied in a clipped tone, her voice betraying just a little of what sounded like fear. We drove in silence for what felt like forever, me desperate to break the ice and her equally determined not to start a conversation. Every occasional glance I snuck her way sent shivers down my spine. Her face was solemn and stiff, lacking any expression that conveyed what she was thinking. It almost seemed to me she was hoping to stay completely unnoticed in an extraneous world. Suddenly, she let out a huge sigh. Scared as I was, my attention was jolted by the sudden noise, and so was she. Startled and surprised all at once, she looked at me and smiled. "Thanks, I thought I was a goner." Those were not comforting words regardless of the situation, and had everything she said and done not already made me really doubt who she was, that goner comment really crossed the line and had me on high alert. I know I had to get her out of my car as quickly as possible. I pulled over at the next available stop, and without warning I turned to her and said, "Get out." She didn't argue, quickly gathering up her things and disappearing into the dark night. I watched her disappear into the distance before driving away with my heart pounding in my chest. That was the end of it, or so I thought. The next day, while browsing the news, an article caught my attention. It was about a serial killer who had been active in the area, preying on unsuspecting victims, and her face was there staring back at me. Turns out, she was actually a man dressed in the clothing and wig of another hitchhiker her had murdered. Terror washed over me with the realization that I had given a ride to a killer, and I was lucky enough to get away alive. I couldn't help but imagine what might have happened to me had I not followed my instincts and kicked him out of the car. Since that day, I've never had the nerve to pick up another hitchhiker, and always avoid driving alone at night. The fear of what could have happened stays with me always, serving as a grim reminder of just how close I came to becoming a victim of a sinister plot. Last summer, I took a road trip with a group of friends through the back roads of the Pacific Northwest. The scenery was beautiful, but what started as a fun adventure turned into something out of a horror movie when we picked up a hitchhiker late one night. It was past midnight when we came across him, standing by the side of the road with his thumb out. Against our better judgment, we pulled over and asked him where he was headed. He was heading in the same direction as us, which seemed too good to be true. He looked unremarkable at first glance, just a scruffy man with a backpack and a smile that seemed a little too eager. But as we continued down the dark, deserted road, things began to feel off. At first, the stranger sat in silence, seemingly content to watch the scenery pass by through the window. But then, he began to ask us strange questions. He wanted to know where we were from, what we did for a living, and why we were on this particular route. It didn't take long for our conversation to grow more uncomfortable and unnerving. His questions took a darker tone, probing into our personal lives with a bizarre intensity that left us all uneasy. Things took a turn for the worse when he started giving us directions that were clearly leading us farther and farther away from where we wanted to go. It was as if he was intentionally steering us away from civilization and deeper into the wilderness. With each passing mile, the hairs on the back of our necks stood on end as we exchanged nervous glances. Every time one of us tried to speak up and challenge him, he would just laugh and say cryptic things that made no sense at all. As time wore on, our hitchhiker became more and more erratic, jumping from one topic to the next in a manic fashion. We had no idea how to deal with him. He was clearly mentally unstable and could turn violent at any moment. It put us all on edge, and it didn't help that we were out in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal or way to call for help. Eventually, we realized that we had to get rid of him before things got even worse. As we were driving down the long and winding stretch of lonely road, our hitchhiker suddenly let out a loud, raucous laugh that sent chills down our spines. The laughter was loud, eerie, and contagious. We had all been sitting silently, feeling anxious and watching the road twist ahead of us, hoping to reach civilization sometime soon. At that point, we had no idea what was coming for us. The hitchhiker's laugh rose, ringing down from the low, cloud-filled skies above. Suddenly, he lunged forward, grabbing the steering wheel and pushing us off the road. Our car spun out of control and rolled over several times before coming to a sudden stop, smashed and bent in the middle of the grassy median. I sat there, frozen in terror, listening to the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears and feeling the sting of cuts and bruises that had landed on me. When I finally looked up to see what has happened, I was struck by a brief moment of confusion and disbelief. There was no other car on the road, no sign of the hitchhiker or any other help. It was only just as the eerie realization dawned upon me that I heard the random taps at the window of my car, and I shrank back into the depths of the seat, fearful of the sight that was about to arise. Peering through the cracked window of the smashed car, I saw the silhouette of the hitchhiker slowly coming closer. I tried in vain to move, to call out for help, but it was all in vain. I was paralyzed with fear. The hitchhiker reached my side and pressed his face against the broken window, his tongue lapping hungrily against the glass as we made eye contact with one another. Then, with a ragged, gasping cry like nothing I'd ever heard before, the hitchhiker flung open the door and pulled me out of the wreckage. He dragged me away from the car and into the darkness beyond, disappearing into the night with me in his grasping, unrelenting hands. Somehow I managed to break away and made a run for it, but the nighttime proved to be the hitch. I was driving down an unlit section of highway where the dark, twisting road stretched out before me like a never-ending black ribbon. I was in the middle of a road trip to visit a friend who lived about 6 hours away, and I'd been driving for hours without seeing another soul on the road. It was an eerie feeling, as if I was the only person left on the planet. I adjusted the radio station, trying to find something to keep me company on the quiet drive. As I was scrolling through the stations searching for any sign of life, I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye. It was a man standing on the side of the road, holding out a hand and looking for a ride. Normally, I wouldn't have even given it a second thought. But something about this guy made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the fact that he was standing in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Or maybe it was the way he was staring at me with unrelenting intensity. Whatever it was, I knew that I didn't want to slow down. But as I passed by him, I saw something in his eyes that made me hesitate. They were dark and empty, as if he was completely devoid of any humanity. There was a coldness about him that seemed to seep into my bones. I almost drove past him entirely, but something inside me made me hit the brakes and pull over onto the side of the road. In retrospect, it was probably one of the stupidest decisions I've ever made. As soon as the hitchhiker got into the car, I noticed how his unpleasant stench filled the air. He immediately started talking, but his voice was deep and unsettling, almost like he was growling at me. I asked him where he was headed, but he couldn't give me a straight answer. Tension started to build inside of me, and I considered telling him I had changed my mind about giving him a ride. But I didn't want to seem impolite or judgmental, so I decided to keep driving. We moved further and further into the darkness, with every mile that passed taking us further from civilization. There were no streetlights, no other cars, no sign of human life. It felt like the two of us were the only souls existing in the world, and the silence inside the car became torturous. The only sound was the man's breathing that became heavier with every mile that passed. I must have drifted off briefly because when I opened my eyes again, something had shifted in the atmosphere inside the car. I noticed that the hitchhiker was no longer sitting in the passenger seat. Before the sound of me being gasping for air had even reached my throat, I felt a cold, aggressive hand on my throat, choking me. With a violent struggle and a scream, I managed to pull the locks in one of the doors up and kick it open. I bolted out of the car and sprinted down the side of the road, my breaths heavy and ragged. There was the sound of crushing gravel behind me, telling me the hitchhiker was in pursuit. Just when I thought it was all over, the hitchhiker let out a guttural shout of anger. I glanced back to see he was now surrounded by a group of people, 5 or 6 of them, all on the edge of madness. They looked nothing like humans. It seemed that they were trying to reach me with anger in their eyes. I could see that their common characteristic was they each had that same coldness in their expressions that I had noticed in the hitchhiker's eyes. In that moment, I realized that these weren't humans. They were some kind of monstrous, supernatural creatures. I had driven right into their world, and I was about to become their next victim. Running on pure adrenaline, I sprinted down the road. My legs ached, and the pain in my chest was practically unbearable. Until, miraculously, there was the faint outline of an approaching vehicle ahead with a familiar symbol police. As the speeding car got closer to me, I screamed for help loud enough for the driver to hear. The police pulled over right next to me, and the creatures collectively retreated back into the darkness. The true terror of that night had come and gone, and I realized how fortunate I was to make it out alive. I would never